Welcome to ADF Insider. My name is Frank Nymphius and I'm from the Oracle JDeveloper Product Management team. In this session I talk about ADF region interaction with a focus set on contextual events. An ADF region exposes a bounded task flow in a specific area of a page. So this allows users to step through a complete navigation process without actually leaving the page. Plus, you can have multiple ADF regions sitting on the same page in parallel, behaving as one single application. The ingredients of an ADF region start with the ADF faces AF region tag, which is the outer container hosting the bounded task flow reference. The AF region tag has a property that requires a pointer to a region model, and the region model determines the current view to be displayed in the course of a navigation. The region model is exposed by a bounded task flow through a specific task flow binding that is added to the page definition file of the page that contains the AF region tag. Optionally, the task flow binding will reference a managed bean, in which case the ADF region is referred to dynamic region. The managed bean method that is referenced from the task flow binding returns the task flow document ID to display in the region. This allows you to dynamically change the bounded task flow exposed in a region, which is used by a pattern like the UI shell. Bounded task flows that are exposed in an ADF region must use page fragments for their views. Page fragments don't have an FView tag as a root document tag in Java server faces. If you build a bounded task flow with standalone documents that contain the FView document tag, then you can easily and declaratively in Oracle JDeveloper transform this bounded task flow into a bounded task flow that uses page fragments. For this you go to the bounded task flow diagram and use the right mouse context menu option to turn this bounded task flow into one that uses page fragments. In the next I want to talk about how to communicate between different regions that are exposed in different areas on a page. As mentioned, the whole page in the end should appear as one to the user. So the user should not be aware which part of the page is a region and which part of the page belongs actually to the parent page itself. And for this we need to establish interaction and communication between different areas on a page, which could be regions then. The goal is to establish communication without breaking the encapsulation that you get through the use of bounded task flows. Bounded task flows are not meant to make any assumption about the context they're running in. So sharing information between the parent page and an ADF region exposing a bounded task flow using a session scope, for example, will create a tight coupling that breaks encapsulation and that makes the bounded task flow no longer reusable because of the assumption the task flow makes. Task flows, or bounded task flows in particular, are supposed to communicate with the outside, with the context they're running in, through defined input parameters and output parameters. And this is what it can use with regions for communication as well. However, there's more than that. If the requirement, for instance, is to communicate with a region without initializing the bounded task flow, in which case the input parameters would be reread, then another technology is required. And there are several technologies in Oracle ADF to provide this interaction, and one of these is contextual events, which is what this session is about. The different patterns of interaction are a parent, which is a containing view talking to the region, a region talking back to the parent. That could be like triggering navigation. So in response to something that happens in the region, you want to have the parent view navigating to another view. And then you have region-to-region interaction, which is two regions sitting on the same parent container or even nested in the same parent container, and they need to exchange communication or just trigger some sort of action in the other region. As mentioned, there are different ways to implement that, but the one that always works is contextual events. And contextual events is the most powerful technology feature in ADF to achieve communication between regions and their parents. A contextual event is a functionality of the ADF binding layer, which also means that you need to have a binding layer to perform this sort of communications. A contextual event allows you to create loosely coupled connections between parent pages and regions. The communication allows you to pass message objects from a producing event to a listening method. The events that you propagate are initiated by some form of event object, so that could be an ADF binding event. There's a specific binding element in Oracle ADF called the event binding, but also you can have events being propagated through ADF bound components, in which case a value change event or a currency change event could be broadcasted through the binding attribute itself, or the tree binding itself. But then for unbound components, you can have Java server faces or ADF faces propagating the native events to whoever is interested. For this, first we need to define an event producer, and as I mentioned, there's a specific event binding element in Oracle ADF that you declaratively create in the page definition file of the page that contains the component raising the event, or the event producer is defined on the attribute binding or the tree binding that either listens for a value change or for currency change if a user selects a different row in a table. A producer has a name which identifies the producer later when it's mapped to its listening part. Optionally, it may have a custom payload defined. The custom payload will override the default native event object. So instead of passing the action event of a JSF bound button, you want to pass something that is expression language referenceable, a managed bean, a session scope, or the binding layer, just to send different information to the listening method than what originally would be sent. If you leave the custom payload empty, then it's always the default payload, the default event object that will be passed. Using a special language in the raise condition property on the producer binding allows you to specify when exactly an event is propagated. So it's not always raised, but just conditionally when the business case requires it. The event type is more for descriptive purpose, because events and event bindings can be reused, and when you create them, then you can decide to either create a new event binding or reuse an existing one, and then the event type will help you to better qualify what a specific event and event name is supposed to do. ADF events that we have available natively as an event object are the DC binding container currency change event. Now this is on the tree binding when the user selects a new row in a table. Then we have the DC binding container value change event. This is the native event object for all ADF bound input fields. And then of course ADF faces and JSF events. Now that could be query events, selection events, or action events. The event consumer is a method, a Java method that you expose to the binding layer. Exposing it to the binding layer means that it needs to be exposed through a data control. And the data control could be one of the existing data controls, like an ADF Business Components data control, where you specify a public method on a view object or an application module and expose that. Or it could be a POJO that you write and then expose as a POJO data control to the ADF binding. Once you have a method binding defined on the page definition file of the view that is supposed to listen for a produced event, then you can use that and you can wire that up, dispatch the event to this view and to this method. As you see in this little code snippet here, the method takes 0, single, or multiple arguments. It's just up to what the method is required to work with. In this case, it's using the DC binding container value change event, which obviously indicates that this method is listening for a value change on an ADF bound text input field. However, if you want to keep it more generic, you could say, okay, that should just have an object type payload. If you want to be more precise, then you can say, okay, the method arguments will be first name, last name, address, and zip code. So very detailed in what you want to pass as an argument to the method. So any sort of argument actually, or method signature, is good to use for defining event consumers. So now with a producer and an event consumer, we need to somehow bring them together. And the way we bring them together is through the ADF binding again. When I talked about ADF regions, I talked about a parent container that contains the region to have a task flow binding, and the task flow binding referencing the bounded task flow. I also said that a view that is exposed in an ADF region, if it listens for an event, must have a page definition file exposing a method binding that points to the method to handle the event. Now, the task flow binding is a binding container. The page definition file of the view exposed in the bounded task flow also is a binding container. The page definition file on the parent page that contains the region also represents the binding container. Now the parent page's binding container has a reference to the task flow binding, which has a reference at runtime to the container used by the fragment, by the page fragment. Now that means we have a hierarchy, like a tree of connected active binding containers that we can use the binding layer to navigate to or to point to. And this is what the dispatching is doing. The dispatching actually has the ability to connect an event producer in an active binding container with an event listener in an active container. If the parent view has access, direct access to the bindings through the task flow binding and or the method binding, then we can use a named producer event, which means that we can explicitly say, well, for this producer event and this event name, we want to have this method binding to be executed. If we cannot directly see the event producer, then we can use a wildcard. So that's an asterisk sign that instead of the producer name, you just put the asterisk in there, and then the mapping will listen for any producer producing event by a specific name. The payload object is always passed with an expression language, and the payload object name that the framework passes to the param name, which is actually the method arguments that you defined in the method binding. The payload is always $, for eager fetching, and then payload with an uppercase L, and this is important, the uppercase L. So payload with an uppercase L points to the default payload. Now that could be the event object, or that could be a custom payload object. If a method requires 3, 4 arguments instead of just 1 argument, which is obviously what we're having in the screenshot, so if it requires more than 1 argument, then you can access detailed information from the payload by $payload dot first name, payload dot last name, payload dot zip, whatever. Yeah. So this is where you can specify more than a single argument for the method listener or for the event listener. But the object, the native object sent by the framework, is always payload, even if your message that you send is a custom. If you have a method that doesn't expect any arguments to be passed, you just ignore the consumer parameters. I mentioned already that event propagation is through the binding layer, and that the binding layer is like a tree of active binding containers that are nested for a specific view or page that you see. When an event is propagated, then it's first propagated to the local container. So that's the container that also has the reference to the component raising the event. So on this container it will look for an event map. If that event map is available, then the event will be propagated. In the next step, it will go to the parent container of the container that raises the event. It looks there for an event mapping, and then it continues and continues up to when it reaches the topmost binding container. On its way up, it broadcasts the event to all named configurations, named producer configurations. Then on the way back, it broadcasts the event propagation to all other active binding containers that are not directly in the parent chain of the raising event. So this is like when it delivers to the rest of the tree. An event cannot be cancelled, but it can be ignored. So you can have a configuration on the binding container, means on the page definition file, or in the ADF config file that would exclude any event to be delivered to asterisks, to wildcard producer definitions, in which case only events can be delivered to a region that has the event mapping defining the producer name particularly. Otherwise, events will just like broadcast it, and then whoever is interested in handling the event will have to check the event object and then maybe further decide whether or not to do that. There is a chance to customize the event dispatcher. It's in the data binding CPX file. In this case, you might come up with your own mechanism to detect whether or not an event has been handled by one of the event handlers and to suppress that, so that if you need to have a single event handling, no matter how many interested listeners are set up, then you can do that. Or on the event dispatcher as well, you have the ability to make that conditional, so that you can say, okay, based on this condition I will dispatch the event, or will just not dispatch the event. But this is going beyond of what we are covering in this ADF Insider session here. Okay, time for a demo. In this demo, it's the most simplest example I can give, is where a text item is created in a bounded task flow, and this bounded task flow will be dragged and dropped as an ADF region multiple times onto a parent page, and then we set up contextual events between text fields on the parent page and these text fields in these ADF regions to pass a value change information to the different regions that are actually bounded task flows listening for a specific event. So let's have a look. For demonstration purposes, I created two workspaces, one for the bounded task flow that will act as the ADF region and that will listen for an event, and one for the consuming application that will host the producing event. My only page fragment exposed on the page definition file contains an input text field that I set to read only, and that has a value reference to a managed bean called the mirror page bean, which contains setter and getter for the mirror value, so the value I want to pass to that component, plus a reference to the input text component instance. So this is a setter and getter to rich input text that I specified on the binding property of the input component. Then I do have an event handler defined, and this event handler is a class that exposes two methods. One method that takes an ADF event argument, so an object, which is to pass a value change from an ADF bound attribute binding to the method. And then I have one method that takes a string as an argument, just to show a custom payload and how you work with a custom payload. In both cases, the argument name is custom payload. It's completely up to you what your naming conventions are for arguments in a method. The more descriptive they are, the better most possibly the reuse experience will be. What I need to point out before continuing is how this method works. So the method will be invoked in response to a producing event. So this is listening for the event, so it will be invoked, it will get a payload. It will then use the faces context class in Java Server Faces, and through expression language will resolve a handle to the mirror page bean that I showed before. As you see, it's in backing bean scope, which is equivalent to the request scope just per instance. And as you will see later, I want to add multiple instances of my bounded task flow as a region onto my page, which requires this to be in backing bean scope. So it gets a handle to the mirror page bean, and then it takes whatever the custom payload is here, sets the new value into the managed bean, and for the output text field to reflect the change, it then calls ADF faces context at partial target, and then refreshes the rich input text field on the page. And that then in response to a producing event should show the value change event payload displayed in the output text field. To make this available to ADF, I need to create a data control from this Java class. So I have a package called data controls, which is just randomly chosen, so you can name it as you want. And then I have the event handler class in here. And again, you can choose a name that goes with your naming conventions in a project. To generate a data control, you just select the event handler class with the right mouse, and then you choose create data control from the context menu, and this then in response and return will create the metadata defining it. And as soon as you have the metadata set up, an entry will be shown in the data control palette for the two methods. So the next step is, because the page definition file of my data change display page fragment is the one that will listen for the producing event, I select this page definition file, close the data control palette, it's no longer needed. And then in the bindings, I would need to create two new entries for a method binding. Now I can do the same from the page, which is a lot easier to do because the dialog is so much nicer. So I go to the bindings tab, and here I just click on the plus icon. This brings up the method action that I need to select. Pressing OK. And then I select the event handler. And you see it exposes two methods which are exposed through the data control. So I select one. I don't need to specify value because this is what I want to pass implicitly through the event. So I just press OK, and then I repeat this for the second method that I want to expose. Okay. So now I have two method binding defined in my page definition file. So whenever these method bindings are called, then they will invoke the method in the event handler Pojo class, and this will then change the value on the input text and refresh it in response to that. So that's all I needed to do on the bounded task flow. So the next step is to deploy this as an ADF library, because I want to reuse that. So when I double click on the project node, then on the deployment definition you see that there's already an ADF library defined. So to create a new one, I just choose ADF library jar file, give the jar file a name, and once I did that, I just OK the dialog. And when I want to deploy that, on the deploy option now, the ADF library entry shows up. An ADF library is deployed as a client jar file, so in this case to the file system. I just step through the wizard and it will put this jar file into the deploy directory of the view folder, or the view controller folder in this case. I'm hitting finish. Now this is going to deploy my project, and that's all I needed to do just to get my bounded task flow deployed. So I can, in the next step in my consumer application, reuse this in the resource palette and then drag and drop this onto my consuming page, and the consuming page then will define a producing event, will map the events, and then we'll see at runtime how contextual events can broadcast a message into this bounded task flow deployed as an ADF library. This is the consuming application that we want to use to expose the bounded task flows in the ADF library as an ADF region. Before I can do this, I need to access the ADF library file, which I can do from the resource palette, and I created a file system connection to the deploy folder that holds the jar file that we created in the previous step. To add this to my view controller project, I just choose add to project, add library, and this now will import the library and reference it from my project. It refreshes my project so that when I have a look at the component palette, the library now is displayed and the bounded task flow is contained under the region section. And now I drag and drop this in and create regions from it. I'm repeating this. So while doing the drag and drop, what happens is it creates an ADF faces region tag in the page and also creates a task flow binding in my page definition file for this department's view. So save the changes. Now when I select the page definition file, as you can see, there are 4 entries for the task flow binding. Each of the entries is referencing the bounded task flow document that we dragged and dropped from the component palette and that is referenced in the ADF library. So that's one part of the sample. So the next part is to create the event producer. And the event producer, the first one I want to create from the department name. When I open the property inspector and scroll down, there's a section called Contextual Events, and in this section I press the plus icon to create a new producer event. So let's call this one on department value change. I can specify the race condition. The race condition will allow me to suppress the broadcasting of this event based on some condition that is expression language accessible, be that eager fetching or deferred fetching. And I can provide some documentation, which is good because it allows me to describe what the producer event is doing. In this case, it's a native ADF bound value change event. Okay. So when I press OK, what happens is that the page definition file is updated, and when I navigate to this file and I expand the department name, then I see there's an events entry under the name, and this is my event definition. In this case, whenever there's a change recognized on the binding layer about a value change, it will now know that it needs to call this event and broadcast that information along with the payload object, which, because I didn't specify custom payload, would be the DC value change event. Another producer I want to create is for this button, and this button is not bound to ADF. Again, I go to the property inspector, I scroll down, and when I press the green plus sign, then what will happen is that I'm creating an event binding entry in my page definition file for the Java Server Faces Action event. So let's call this JSF Action event. In this case, I want to override the payload. I don't want to see the action event object being passed as a payload. Instead, I'm interested in the location ID. So I use an expression language reference for the custom payload object. For documentation, I can put in JSF action event publishing location ID. Okay. Again, saving the changes. Now when I go back to the page definition file, what I see is that I have an event binding created here, and this event binding actually contains the JSF action event I created, and this JSF action event is configured to listen for Java Server Faces actions. On the same side, if I select the button and open up the property inspector, then on the action listener for this button, I can see that this now points to bindings, event binding, which is my event binding definition in the page def file listener, and then it calls process action. And that would be the same if that was a query event or if that was a selection event in a table. Just the listener configured on the event binding would be different there. So I've set up my environment, so I do have a producer event created, I do have an event listener created. Now it's about time to map them, and for this I can use the binding tabs, because in this case I want to have the department's Vue.js page to become the event mapping, the parent, because it's able to see both the producer and the event listeners. Now if the producing event was in a region, then this here had in its page definition file a task flow reference to the producing region as well, in which case still it could be used as the event handler and mapper. So I see two events created on this page definition file. If the producer event was in its own region, then that would be empty here, because then the configuration for the producing event would be within the page definition file of the Vue that hosts the component raising the event. So what I need to do here is just subscribe to the event, pressing the plus icon here, selecting available events. You see I have two events available. So let's start with the department value change event, producer, wildcard, or named producer. So let's choose the named producer, and then from the list of task flow bindings, which now expose their event handlers, I can now select what I want to have this to handle. So use the one that takes the event handling object, and now map the method argument to the payload. So the method argument was custom payload. Here of course you would have to put in the names that you specified in the method arguments. And this string is always the same. It's eager fetching, so use the $, pay uppercase load. If this method was taking more than a single argument, what you could do is you could add more arguments here and then use payload.firstname, payload.lastname, or whatever the payload object exposes as an additional properties. So that's the first. Let's create another one. And the other one I want to create again for the this time for the JSF action event. I also want to do this for a named producer, but this time, because it's a named event, I pass it to the string payload. So that's the method action that takes the string payload. Now remember that I mapped the custom payload to reply the location ID and no longer the object. So I need to make sure that I map this to the correct method. Again, it's really helpful if the method handler that you specify has a good naming scheme. And again, it named it custom payload, and here I use the same reference because the payload object now contains the location ID, not the event, but that is all that I'm expecting. So I created this. You see that still it only shows one mapping here because we have this event selected. So if I select the other event, then I see the other mapping. So let's create one more mapping for each of them. But this guy's for the wildcard producer, again on department value change, which is the ADF bound broadcasting. And now we leave it to any, which is listening for any producer raising an event of type on department value change. Yeah, so that is doing exactly the same as a named event producer. It's just handled later, and it's handled anywhere in the tree of active bounded or active binding containers. And now I select the handler, and the handler I use my third region to do that. So custom payload, Okay. Saving it up. And now you see I have two entries here, still one entry on the other one, but we're changing this next. So now again we take JSF action here as an event. We leave it to any, and now we assign this event to our fourth region that we created. Again, custom payload and the payload object. Just remember, if there were more than one argument, that would be payload dot whatever property is exposed. And note this tab here, so here I could use expression language to identify or to specify a condition under which I want to have the dispatching handled. So in my use case where I said that you want to have the event handled only by one event handler, you might have a session memory variable that you write to, and then have this handle condition checking that if that should be dispatched or if it shouldn't be dispatched. Because keep in mind that this event handling could be in many binding containers. So if that is the first, that is the binding container that belongs to the event producer. So this is what I refer to on the slides as a local container. This container gets the event first. So if this knows how to handle the event, a flag could be set in the session. But then it will broadcast the event to other binding containers. And if those binding containers have event handlers, and they would have the handle condition set to look to the session attribute or session memory attribute and check whether or not this was handled and broadcasted, then they might decide not to dispatch the event anymore, in which case it would just stop there. You see, there's a good level of flexibility in broadcasting and receiving contextual events. You can have a handle condition on the producing event, so whether or not to raise the event, but you can also have this in the dispatching case. Plus you have the options in the data binding CPX file to override the event dispatcher and do your own thing. So in this case, just we'll leave it as it is. So this is the actual form I created. So you see the ADF bound form here, and you see the yet empty panel boxes, but you can see that the ADF region is there because it has now the mirror value, which is currently set to empty. So if I change the administration value to administrations, just appending an S, and I click submit default value, which is just doing a submit, a form submit, then you will see a change in two of the panel boxes due to the contextual events sent out. Now if I click this button, then remember that this one just looks at the location ID and sends an action event that broadcasts the location ID, and this will update the two other boxes, one for the named producer event and one for the wildcard producer event. And now when I change back this value and just hit this button, then because it's also a submit for the form, two events will fire, one for the value change event, one for the action event. Just to make this more apparent, I will also change the value of the location ID. So now I should see all four fields changing, which is a great example of how contextual events can process parallel events occurring at the same time. And I did not have to refresh the regions by itself. So I only called into the ADF region and then had the region receiving the event. The event then was getting an access to the managed bean that has a reference to the input text field and refreshing the input text field. The only remaining question now is, when would you use a wildcard producer and when you use a name producer? Well, a name producer can be used if virtually the binding container that actually maps the event producer to the event name, if this can see the event producer container. So if the event container with the producing event is somehow nested deeply in the hierarchy of containers, then you would use a wildcard producer. The other use case when you want to use wildcard producer is if there are many producing events that produce the same action event, yeah, so that you might have different origins for this event and you want to listen for all, then you use the wildcard producer event. So this concludes this demo. What I demonstrated is how to create a bounded task flow in a separate workspace and set it up for listening for contextual events. And contextual event listening is through method bindings or operation bindings, which I didn't mention so far. So you can have an ADF data control exposed operation to listen to an contextual events like an execute or execute with params event, because these are action bindings as well and can be used for contextual events. I then showed how to create a producing event in a consumer application, import the bounded task flow as a region from an ADF library, and then connect the producer with the event through the event mapping. You could easily take the producing event into a bounded task flow itself, expose it as an ADF region, then in the page definition file of the view that is part of the region, configure the event binding, and then use the parent page definition file just for the event mapping. Yeah, so it's very flexible, but this works for all three patterns that we learned about: parent to region, region to parent, and region to region, because it goes across the boundaries, because just of the ADF binding layer, which is like a tree of active binding containers that you can broadcast events to. So this concludes this session about contextual events for the ADF Insider recording. If you want to learn more, there's the Oracle JDeveloper website on OTN or oracle.com, as you see listed here. You can download the latest and greatest of software. You get additional tutorials. The discussion forum is referenced from there, and I really like you to go to the OTN forum, ask your question, help us answering questions. You get samples there, developer guides. There's a lot of traction recently about mobile development with Oracle ADF, so you might want to explore that. If it happens that this recording is something that's brought to you by email or by a Google search, there's a homepage associated with the ADF Insider series where you can get a lot more recordings like this, explaining in-depth functionality and features in ADF. Plus there's the ADF Code Corner website that I'm running to provide you with samples, also including a sample on contextual events and other very interesting topics that worth sharing with developers. Wherever there's something good to say, there are books to follow, and we do have 3 out on Oracle ADF. So from the left to the right, going from beginner to more advanced. So we have the Fusion Quick Start Guide that allows you to, if you haven't had any background experience with Java or Java development or Java EE development, then that's definitely the book you want to start with, just giving you an introduction to ADF on a purely on the declarative level so that you can start working. Then we have the Oracle JDeveloper 11G Handbook, which is a long end-to-end hands-on experience that the authors guide you through. And eventually we do have the Oracle Fusion Developer Guide, which Lynn Munzinger and myself wrote, covering more advanced topics, going beyond of what the drag and drop functionality provides in Oracle ADF. So these 3 books basically cover all of what you need to know about ADF, and they're complementing the Oracle product documentation that you can get from OTN. So this all now makes a very big library of information that you can get. But still there are more out. There are block entries, there are ADF Code Corner, there is an OTN Harvest block recently started. So there's plenty of information available on ADF.